Shalom and good day all, this is Tehillim29 back again for another DC comic review, and this time I'll be reviewing two comics that are sort of like connected to something that's had a connection to TV or movies or cinema. As you can see, we've got Batman 89, issue 1 of 6, and we've got Pennyworth, issue 1 of 7. And I must admit, I did sort of have to read through Batman 89 a second time just to make sure that the rating I was going to give it is correct. So that's the first one that we'll be starting off with. So moving into first things first, does this cover in any way, shape or form sort of connect to something that happens inside the story? In some part it actually does, and it's really nice to see. I think the cover's great, but does it work with the story? Not as much. And this is where I gave the cover a rating of 6 out of 10. Now it's time to move into the internal art, which I'll show you around the beginning, middle, and of course, the end. So, moving into first things first, we have some art around the beginning of the story. And as you can see, this takes place in Gotham City. And we also get the time when it takes place, which is really good. So we know that this is all happening on the same day. And as you can see there, we've got our Harvey Dent meeting up with one of his colleagues, I believe. It wasn't very clear, so I assumed that they were a colleague. Now for some art around the middle. Now this is some of the art around the middle. I must admit, I really did sort of like the art in this. In some parts it felt a little bit cartoony, but other parts not. And of course we've got the Batmobile on scene. And of course, Bruce Wayne. And I gotta be honest, I hate that fucking haircut. I mean, I hate that fucking haircut. I can't be the only one that doesn't like it. And he looks like he's got to at least be, I don't know, 60 something in the picture. Where when we actually saw the movie, he looked a little bit younger. Right, that's my only criticism in regards to this. But apart from that, the rest of the art did seem to come off alright. Now, some art towards the end. And as you can see here, we've got James Gordon, who's now the commissioner. And talk about destroying a character. They've literally destroyed the character in his appearance here. It looks nothing like the James Gordon from the actual movie. It feels like they've taken a James Gordon from like something else and just planted a fat ass into it. Just being blunt about it. That's the thing about Rainbow Press and Comics. In order to keep it colourful, you've got to be honest about what's happening here. But I'll have to cover what's happening in regards to this part of the rating when we reach the story. Apart from that, the rest of the art came off pretty fine. And this is where I give the rating for the art, to which I gave it a 7 out of 10. Now, what about the story? To be honest, I did want to rate this higher. There were some things in there that did actually help work with the story. And I mean, did help with the story. But there were also other things that didn't help with the story, as you can see in the areas I just pointed out before. And that does affect the story rating. To which we jump into time. When does it take place? Of course, October 31st, and we also get the time that it actually happens at night. We don't get the exact time when it happens at night, but it would not hurt to include it in the story. Like, even if it's, say, 9, 10, 11 p.m., right? Just include those little details, because they do help to make a story come off better. The location, of course, is Gotham City, where Batman works out of. And of course, we had the appearance of City Hall. The cast of characters consisting of Harvey Dent, James Gordon, Commissioner Gordon, Batman, Bullock, Alfred, and someone calling himself by the name of Slappy, which was a bit of a clown of some sorts. Now, this clown, as far as we know, has no connection to the Joker in this, because I believe that this is meant to come off sort of like after the Batman 89. So sort of like something that's happening in between both this movie and the next movie. To which I gave the story rating a 5 out of 10. Right? Even though it had these little details, it sort of had the making for a good story. To which I gave the story rating a 5 out of 10. So now it's time to jump into the review of Pennyworth. Does this cover in any way, shape or form connect to something that's happening inside the story? Surprisingly, in part, it actually does. And I really like the cover. And yes, what you see there is something that he is also connected to within the story. The Russians. To which you also learn of his involvement with them. To which I gave this cover a 6.5 out of 10. Now it's time to move into the internal arts, which I'll show you some art around the beginning, middle and the end. Starting off with some art around the beginning. As we can see here, we've got Pennyworth, or Alfred Pennyworth, interrogating one of his victims in trying to extract some information. And as you can see, we see this takes place in Paris, and he's of course learning about some parts in regards to the Soviet ambassador, plus a couple of other things along the way. I'll now move towards the middle. This is some of the art around the middle, where he's working with someone he knows, and you do learn that this someone he knows that he's working with is someone that is also connected to his childhood, and the character's name is Shirley. Now, I'm sort of wondering why, I think George Bush is in here. It looks like George Bush. Even though it might be unintentional, he sort of looks like George Bush. And now, let's move to the art towards the end. Now, this is some of the art towards the end. Now, if it's one thing I really want to point out here, is that we've got the use of Morse code being used. And you get to see this quite a bit throughout the book. It does make the story a little bit more interesting story-wise. There's one of the villains he's up against, and by his appearance, he sort of reminds me that he might be KG Beast. I might be incorrect on it. But the character did certainly grab my attention. So for the art in this, because there was a lot of skipping back and forth a bit between the past and the present, I did feel like it affected the art rating, to which I gave the art rating 5 out of 10. And of course, George Bush in there too. Who the fuck likes him? Definitely not me, and I'm glad he's not my president. Alright, moving into the story. My goodness, now, the story was alright for what it was, but let's see the things that it actually brought up in the story. In regards to time, this is sort of how it went in within the story, in pretty much the chronological order it went in. First it started off with then years ago, then now, then we got years ago twice, and now twice. And my goodness, this is why in some part the beginning of this story felt very confusing, and they just couldn't manage to keep it sort of like kept in one area for a little bit longer, but instead there was a jump. There is one part in the story when one of those things are used and you get to see a present day old Alfred. And he's talking about what he's doing is to help save someone's son. But it's not pointed out as to which this son is. Is it Bruce Wayne? Is it someone else? We've got no idea. For all we know, it could be Damian Wayne. Or even one of the Robins. We've got no idea. Or even his own son. It's very unclear on that, but it still makes for an interesting story. Now, the only location that I did manage to get out of this, of course we did have Paris, but of course it wasn't pointed out in the locations as to where like some of the things were taking place. And of course parts of Russia again. One we did get pointed out was Nagaskoy, and it almost felt like it was somewhere in Asia. The cast of characters consisting of Alfred, Shirley, and the character who I believe to be KG Beast. Now, I must admit, where the previous story sort of failed a bit, I felt like this one actually sort of picked up a bit. Yeah, it was a little bit confusing, but I did actually like seeing what was happening in this story. I might consider, and I mean might consider, picking up the second issue. That's providing that the second issue sort of like irons some of the things out that happens in this issue, and maybe just gives us stuff around the past to moving into sort of like a couple of years into the future before addressing to where things are in the present. Now, I think if it sort of did it that way, this story could be great. But I'll have to wait until that happens. So the story rating I gave for this was 6.5 out of 10. Well, until then, let's keep it colourful and have yourself an awesome day.